We're going to record this webinar, so you hear that notification, and let's go ahead and get started. So glad you're here this afternoon with us. I know this topic is not necessarily easy to talk about, and whether you're here because you're facing a budget gap or because you want to be proactive about your congregation's future, you're in the right place. For those of you I don't know, my name is Laura Watson. It is my privilege to be the Vice President, Director of Programs here at MMFA. This is my 14th year with the foundation, so truly a blessing to get to do the work that I do with our ministries. And this afternoon, over the next 50 minutes or so, we're going to look at something that MMFA believes all churches need to be thinking about, and that's alternative income streams, innovative income streams. But before we dive in, I want to take a quick poll. So if your camera is on, I'm going to invite you to raise your hand if your congregation's giving has felt a little bit unpredictable in the past few years. I want to see some hands. How many folks feel like giving to your church has been unpredictable in the last few years? And then how about raise your hand if you have a church building that has unused spaces, part of your property that's not being used or is empty during the week. Any space that's unused at your church, times of day where your church is empty. Okay, so if you raised your hand to either or both of those, again, you're in the right place. So you see there on the screen our agenda for our time together today. First, we're going to look at some of the realities that so many of our congregations are navigating, and then we'll explore 5 different practical income streams. I'll be sure to mention some real things that real Moravian churches are doing in these spaces. And then after that, we'll talk a little bit about how to shift your congregation's financial culture. Because 5 ideas on income streams aren't going to get anywhere if you don't have buy-in and a healthy mindset around this work. And then we will spend a little time talking about next steps and resources and have some time for conversation at the end. My hope is that you will leave feeling inspired for where your church could start. So first, let's look at some of the financial pressures that our congregations are experiencing. Churches are dealing with a lot right now, and you see some examples of those things there on the screen. Bills are going up for many congregations, and giving hasn't returned to what it was before the pandemic for lots of our churches. And as the world feels uncertain, especially when it comes to the economy, a lot of people are not comfortable making financial commitments to their churches. And fewer people might be coming to worship regularly, which can lead to a decrease in income. And yet, we know that our call to mission is still there. Our call to love our neighbors is still there. Our building still needs to be cared for, and our church staff certainly needs to be cared for as well. They need to be paid. So I want to say something important before we go any further, which is that if your church is struggling financially, that doesn't mean that you've failed. It means that you're living in this time a very real economy with real people in a real moment that certainly is challenging. So what's important to remember, again, it's not that the church is failing if you're struggling financially. It's to think about what the faithful response is to that struggle. And that's not despair. That's not to stick our heads in the sand. And
no, he said he was going to be in a little bit later. I've talked to him. He was doing, your mom probably won't be here till 2 or 3 o'clock.
What you've always been doing. So the important thing to do is to be creative and to be courageous, which we know is a very Moravian response. If you think about our denomination's history, there's a lot of creativity and courage for hundreds of years, especially when it came to finances. Early Moravians supported their work through a very efficient system of communal labor and commercial networks. They didn't rely on one source of income. So what does that mean for us today? Because you might be thinking, well, Laura, the world's really different than it was in the 1700s. When we think about financial stewardship as a stool, traditionally there have been 3 legs, and those are the offering plate. That's one source of income. Another is planned giving, bequests, and those kinds of gifts. And then a third is capital giving, campaigns for capital expenditures. But again, knowing that we live in this very different time than our ancestors, our fourth leg. We need to add this 4th component of alternative income streams. So as we think about those innovative sources of income, we're not doing something radical. We're doing something that our forebears did with creativity and courage. We're asking how we can sustain and even grow the work that God is calling us to in the world. And that's a holy question, and I'm really glad that you're willing to ask it. So we've thought a little bit about financial pressures. Now we think about the reality of our theology and shifting mindsets. Oftentimes money and ministry, faith, and finances live in two very different boxes in our congregations, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. What I want to lift up to you now is, again, as we remember that financial struggling doesn't mean that you're failing at your mission, just remembering that the church has always found creative ways to fund its work. It's accepting that faithful stewardship means asking hard questions, not avoiding them. It means we have to look in the mirror and be honest about what we see, and then give ourselves permission to do something about it without fear and with imagination. So here you see a couple of shifts that I really think are important for our congregations to consider. That's embracing those new ideas without fear, and then giving ourselves permission to think differently. And I love that passage from Isaiah as a grounding for this idea, because behold, we are doing a new thing.
Hey, Sammy.
So here you see the 5 income streams that we're going to get into today. Again, I'm going to encourage folks to make sure that you're muted. So here on the screen,
are you hungry?
Property income, grants, social enterprise, partnerships, and financial stewardship. So today we're going to take a balcony level view of each of these, because going in depth into them would require another separate webinar, and we don't have time to do that. So just want to focus generally on benefits and tips for each, and then things for you to consider if this is an avenue that you might want to pursue. None of these, let me be clear, are a silver bullet, a financial silver bullet in which you're going to quickly take away pressure on your church's budget overnight. These are not quick fixes. But since we know that offering plate income can't be the only leg of our stool, our ministry's financial stool, these are some possible paths forward as you add that alternative income leg. Again, so if you are here hoping you're going to come away with something that you can quickly implement in a week or a month or even by the end of the year, and money will just start pouring out, that is not a realistic expectation. However, these paths, again, all have a place for our ministries as a possible source of revenue, and MMFA is happy to help as you start thinking about which one is right for you. So let's take a look first at income stream number 1. That's property. Your church building may be the most underutilized asset that you have. Again, what spaces are empty and when? How many hours is it actually occupied? And what could happen in it during the hours that it currently isn't being used? So we have a lot of congregations, Moravian churches, who are renting some of their property. I actually did I know some of this through my work, right? But I did a quick Google to see what would come up, and then went to each church site to confirm that it was in fact true, my results that I got. And so I know here in North Carolina, Clemens Moravian, Union Cross are both congregations that rent fellowship halls and part of their facilities. And I saw Newdorf up in New York. I saw Emmaus in Pennsylvania, just to name a few. So again, as you start thinking about this as a possible avenue to pursue, you've got churches that you can reach out to. MMFA would be happy to be a bridge for you and connect you with somebody to talk to. So as you think about renting, that could be that you say, we're going to take our beautiful fellowship hall and let folks in the community use it for family celebrations, events, things like that. You might have a local group that would come in and rent some space, like a homeschool co-op, or perhaps you have a wonderful commercially licensed kitchen and you rent it to a caterer who is in need of that space. All kinds of possibilities here. The important thing to know is that renting property can be a source of steady income, as well as increase your visibility and your connections in the community. And you see at the bottom of the slide some considerations, a few things to watch out for as you start exploring renting your property. And those are going to vary from city to city, state to state, things like zoning restrictions, what your property insurance policy says, what needs to go into a rental contract. And you also want to be careful about any kind of rental that might trigger what's called UBIT, unrelated business income tax. We're going to talk about that more towards the end of our time together. That's something that could come if you decided to regularly rent your space to a for-profit entity, for example. Again, laws vary from state to state, so you'll definitely want to have a conversation, possibly with provincial office, a CPA, or even a local attorney before you sign anything in terms of a rental. And you want to think about who you're renting to, obviously. Yes, who is it going to be a good relationship? Is it a group that's in line with the mission and ministry of your church? Another resource that's great for considering property rental is from the organization Rooted Good. Be happy to get you connected with that. Their program is called How to Rent Well, and it helps you discern what space you might rent, how much you're going to rent it for, who you're renting it to, and some of the other key aspects of renting church property. And we highly recommend utilizing something like this with your board as you start having these conversations in earnest.
What was the name of that organization you just said?
Rooted Good, and it'll be at the end too. So, and I should tell you that you'll get all these slides and the recording and everything too, so that you can also go back and review things. But thanks for the question. Speaking of questions, that led nicely into the next slide. If you have ever read Grace Pomeroy's book, Funding Forward, these questions come from that book, and I'll reference it again at the end. And in her work for the Luther Seminary, Grace followed a lot of different congregations as they pursued alternative income streams. And she got their stories, what worked, what didn't work, data, et cetera. It's a wonderful book to read as you consider some of these different options. What she knew to be true for the churches that really floundered is they got so understandably hyper-focused on the income generation that they lost sight of mission and ministry and how God was calling their church. So she suggests for each different alternative income stream you might be considering a series of questions that you need to be thinking about. And you see those there on your screen. So I'm not going to go through them word by word. You all can read them. But just important to, as you're thinking about who could we rent to, how much will it cost, all those technical, logistical, legal sides of the matter, that you're keeping God's voice in it all and discerning how God's calling your congregation and how it utilizes its property. Okay, our second income stream is grants. A lot of churches don't realize that there's money out there specifically designated for congregations that are doing community work. And oftentimes that money goes unclaimed because churches don't think that they won't qualify because they're a religious organization. Certainly there is a lot of grant money that's not available to religiously affiliated organizations, but more and more there is money for churches that are doing community impact programs. So don't presume that you're not going to be eligible for grants. And that grant funding for churches typically comes from three places: the denomination itself, community local family foundations, that could be a city foundation, a state foundation, and there are even some government sources for services like food programs or rural health initiatives. So those are typically the three sources for churches. Again, the denomination itself, community foundations, and possibly the government as well. So a church that runs a food pantry or hosts a clothing closet or offers any kind of community outreach may be eligible for grants to support that work directly. The key there is that grants aren't going to fund your operations. They fund the program. So you're not going to get a grant to pay your light bill, but you could get a grant to help fund your feeding ministry, which would then free up some of the congregational giving, your offering plate income, for other things. So you see here on the slide some tips. I always suggest start with what you're already doing. At your next board meeting, write down every way that your church serves the community, even things that you think are small, and then start seeing, okay, which of these might be something that we could pursue as a grant application. First thing you could do is reach out to MMFA, and we'd be happy to talk to you about our grant making program. I know both Northern and Southern Province, Eastern and Western District, there are other grant opportunities through different organizations within our denomination. So explore those options. Happy to be your first point of contact for any of that and to point you in the right direction. But really be thoughtful about what are we already doing, what's our mission, our vision, how is God calling us, and how could we impact the community more with some grant money to support this work. So those are some things to be thinking about. If you have ever dipped your toe into the grant writing pool, you know it's a time-consuming job, and there are professionals who do it at a high level of six-figure grants, that kind of thing. And grants, of course, come with reporting requirements. So there's an issue of who's going to do this, what capacity do they have to take this on. This is not something that we would recommend that the church say, well, our pastor should be the one to start doing this. It needs to be folks, lay leaders in the congregation, perhaps in conjunction with pastor, but this shouldn't land on your pastor's shoulders. You may also want to consider whether your church should establish its own separate 501c3 designation with the IRS. That oftentimes opens up doors for additional grant funding that might be closed to you as a faith-based organization. I can think of an example of this that comes out of East Hills Moravian Church in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. They had a freezer ministry that began within the congregation. And as the ministry grew, more churches, Moravian, non-Moravian, got involved. It expanded, and eventually they established themselves as their own standalone 501c3 called the Freezer Ministry and Garden Growers. And that group is getting ready to expand into another city in Bethlehem. So since they are no longer under the umbrella of the church, they're able to apply for grants from other organizations who wouldn't have granted to the church itself. So something to think about. That is its own set of work to do to establish that 501c3, but a consideration as you think about grants as an income stream. And then some questions to consider as well from Grace Pomeroy's Funding Forward book. So again, making sure that God's voice is present in all these conversations. And I especially like that last one. Are you prepared to faithfully steward these work resources, not just financially, but in prayer, accountability, and community? A grant is a big commitment from the organization that grants you the money, as well as for you to receive it. And again, I'd be happy to talk to you more about that through the lens of MMFA's grant making program, as well as more generally if you need a conversation partner as you think about this. Our third income stream is what's called social enterprise. And across the board, this tends to be the income stream that's the most unfamiliar to churches. And it's really pretty simple. It's a business activity that's run by your congregation that serves both a community need and generates revenue. So some examples of this might be starting a preschool program in your church building, or turning an underutilized space into a community coffee shop. I think about Common Grace, which is a ministry out in Madison, Wisconsin. Common Grace was started when the Lakeview Moravian Church congregation merged with a Lutheran congregation in the neighborhood. So they now are Common Grace, and they established what's called the Eastmoreland Community Center. And that community center earns revenue by renting space and also having donation suggested programs and events. So they offer things to the community and invite people to make a donation as they're able, source of income. And so that's a great example of a social enterprise. Here in North Carolina, again, Union Cross Moravian Church in Kernersville, they operate a thrift shop in a building that's right down from their congregation, or from their church building sanctuary. So there's different ways that you can approach this business activity that's run by your congregation. Again, the question to be thinking about here is, what does our community need, and what assets and gifts do we have to meet that need? So in the case of Union Cross, they had an asset of space and a community need for folks that are low income, who thrift shop would be a place that they could come to get clothing and household goods, all those things that you find at thrift shops, right? So this was a great place for them to step into this social enterprise market. So again, as you're thinking about this, it's important to be aware of your people. This kind of model can take a lot of energy, volunteers to staff whatever the business looks like, and to keep it going. And so again, it helps to start with something that your congregation is passionate about, that it'll be an easy yes. They're already motivated to do it, and that's a stronger motivation than just the financial benefits, certainly. Again, this is something that takes time to set up and to begin to earn money. In the Funding Forward book, what they found with churches that started social enterprises, it usually took 2 to 3 years even for them to really begin to earn money. So you just have to be intentional about how long it's going to take. Do you have the folks that are able to make the commitment to get it off the ground, and what that will look like for your church? Again, you see on here UBIT, unrelated business income tax. So just an awareness that as you generate revenue through this business that's run by the church, it could potentially, with the IRS, trigger some income tax. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. Questions to think about as you discern whether you want to begin a social enterprise. Again, allowing God's voice in this discernment process. All right, fourth, let's look at partnerships, because sometimes income can come not from a new program, but from a relationship. So think about the organizations who are already working in your community or in your neighborhood, even local nonprofits, healthcare systems, schools, county agencies, etc. A lot of these need space, and some of them might need a trusted partner, and some of them even have budget money for this kind of thing. So what could this possibly look like? Church might partner with the local health department to host monthly wellness events on their property, or with a local nonprofit who is doing feeding but needs expanded space. So the church could utilize its property to become a feeding hub for that group and receive a small stipend for the use of the space. A church with a really big parking lot might want to contract with emergency management office as a staging point and receive compensation for that designation. So there's a lot of different possibilities here for partnerships that can help earn some revenue. And as is the case with some of these other streams, property rental, for example, they can help build your church's visibility and reputation in ways that could really be of benefit. If your local hospital or your school system sees you as a trusted, reliable partner, then doors can open to you. When I think about a Moravian example for partnerships at work, I think about Calvary Moravian here in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. They partner with our local bookstore that happens to be one street over from the church. And that bookstore uses the church's property for book festivals, author events, things like that. And the partnership goes both ways as well. It's not just about the bookstore utilizing space the church has, but how the church is able to utilize benefits from the bookstore too. So as you think about partnerships that might generate income, be sure to be clear on what you're saying yes to, exactly what is being negotiated in this agreement. And you want to have some kind of formalized agreement on paper, of course. And also you want to make sure that the partnership is with an organization that has exemplary leadership, high level of regard in the community. Ideally, their mission is going to align with your church's mission and values. You want to be proud of this partnership and excited to share it with the community. So things to be thinking about. Again, where we see congregations flounder is when it's all about money and what can we do to get more money in the door. You might misstep and end up in a partnership that's really not of benefit for the congregation, or misaligned even with who you are. So just things to be thinking about as you explore different partnerships. And of course, questions to be asking too. Important one, number one, who in your congregation already has a connection with a potential partner? If you've ever done asset mapping, one of your assets at your church are your people and their relationships and their connections. So look at that and determine, hey, who do we have that knows someone that could lead to a partnership that might be a source of income for us? And again, being intentional about whether it would align with God's call for your congregation, as well as whether it would cause any kind of theological conflict. If you end up with a partnership with a group that is not in line with what we believe as Moravians and how we live that out, that's problematic. So again, being thoughtful around these questions will help serve you well as you enter the partnership arena. And our final income stream to think about is financial stewardship, good old traditional financial stewardship. We could not offer this webinar without asking you to consider how to strengthen the efforts that you're making to form generous stewards in your congregation. I always like to say that Jesus was the ideal steward, so we have a role model to follow here. So if your church decides to do something talking about financial stewardship this year, and I hope that it will, I'm happy to help, let Jesus be the role model. Identify 4 ways Jesus lived as a steward and lift those up to the congregation, teach them, talk about them, etc. I can share that, our version of that program with you if it would be of benefit. We also know, of course, that Jesus talked a lot about money. So if you are uncomfortable talking about financial stewardship, let Jesus do the talking. Use Jesus's words and be clear that you are speaking to how our relationship with money can impact our relationship with God as Jesus did. So also be sure that you're making that connection between money and mission. That's explicit. So whether you use a narrative budget, you tell stories, intentional offertory practices, the list could go on. There's lots of ways to do this. Make sure that you're being clear that it's not just about money, it's about the mission you're able to do because of that income. MMFA, of course, always ready to help with this for free. If you choose this stream, and I really hope that you will, want you to be careful to set the right tone. If you have your back against the wall, you're really feeling a pinch financially, it would be easy to say this is all about money to help us keep the lights on. But that's not the tone that you want to set for this. You want to use messaging that focuses on what God wants for us as his children, as stewards of everything that God entrusts to us, and be thoughtful about how you're going to educate people, ideally throughout the year, not just one time, as well as the why behind it. So I always like to say, if you're going to ask me to give more of my time or my talent or my treasure, why should I? And that response that you have, again, is because we are striving to follow Jesus' example, to be disciples, and to help people see how their acts of stewardship are helping the church work towards the mission that God is calling it to. So yes, those financial gifts are going to help you pay the bills, but that's not the messaging that you want to use as you're inviting people to think about their financial gifts and as you're forming them as faithful and generous stewards. So questions for you to think about here. These come from MMFA. What does your church believe about stewardship? If you don't have an answer that most folks agree on, that's a great place to start. Don't start using the word again until you know for sure what you mean by it and what you believe about it. How do people know what stewardship means in the congregation? And how do people know what their gifts enable the church to do? So there's some simple ways to get started with all 3 of these. And as I've said, MMFA is happy to help. All right, switching gears abruptly from the joy of financial stewardship to the joy of taxes and understanding UBIT. So you see here on the screen a simple definition. This is just income tax that results from activities that are not substantially related to your exempt mission. Your exempt mission is, of course, what you told the IRS you were all about when you got established as a church, what the province says that the church is about, because a lot of our ministries fall under the provincial umbrella. So as long as your mission statement is current and relevant and you're about worship and community needs and those kinds of things, you've got a good mission to fall back on here. So as you look at the slide, there's some different things to be thinking about. Again, we could do an entire webinar on this, so I'm not getting too into the weeds with it, but just wanted you to have a few basics. Rental income from your property is typically safe. You see a few exceptions there. So just watch out if you've got a mortgage on your building or if you're renting on a regular basis to a for-profit entity. Earned income, if you're getting that regular income from an activity that's related to your mission, then that would not trigger unrelated business income tax. So if your church, for example, has a recovery ministry, works with folks who are coming out of incarceration or who are battling addiction, and you decide to launch a small company, maybe it's a lawn care company to employ them, and you earn some money as a church from that, that would be tied closely to the ministry, the recovery ministry, the mission of the church. So wouldn't be a risk for the UBIT. But if you've got some people at the church who have great lawn care equipment. Maybe they just retired from owning their own lawn care company, and you decide as a church, we're going to start our own lawn care business. That is problematic because that's not tied to any ministry. It's just a financial benefit for the church. So the IRS is going to look at what you're doing as well as why you're doing it. So making sure always for all of these, the goal is to align them with mission and ministry and not just be about more money for the church. There are some exceptions you see there in the third bullet point. If you get income from volunteers, then that wouldn't be a risk here. If you receive items, they're donated to you, you sell them, that's not going to trigger UBIT. And then if you get income from activities that are primarily geared towards your members, that's not a problem either. So an example from my own church, I think for that is we have a group called the Soup Group that makes homemade soup and things, has it available for people that need it. But then several times a year we sell it and make money to then go back into making more soup. But it's income to the church, right? But it's safe because the only people we're selling the soup to are our own members. So that's that member convenience activity. So if you have coffee at church before or after and you decide to put a donations accepted basket out, that's income. It's not going to trigger UBIT because it's the member convenience activity. Documentation is key. Just make sure that you are keeping track of how those income generating activities are connected to your mission, and always try to consult with a CPA before you get started with any of these. Again, the provincial office, even an attorney, but a CPA who's familiar with nonprofits is going to be a great resource before you undertake any of these different income streams, with the exception of grants and financial stewardship, of course. All right, so as I said at the beginning, you can have all the wonderful ideas in the world. You can have 4 different things you're thinking about that you want to explore for alternative income. But if the mindset at your church is off for that, they're not going to go anywhere. You've got to have buy-in. So if you want to get traction on any of these, you're going to have to look at the culture around money in your congregation and determine whether it needs some work before you get going. So again, if you keep faith and finances in 2 separate boxes, if those financial decisions are made behind closed doors or even behind a really small group of people, the same people year after year, if information isn't shared appropriately with the congregation, all of those are red flags for how the culture might not be ready to possibly explore some of these alternative ideas. If people get really uncomfortable even just talking about money, which is so true in so many of our churches, or if it feels unspiritual, then there are steps you can take to help with that. Even as you might start researching different revenue streams. So a few tips, again, use the Bible, follow Jesus' example, use Jesus' words. Money's not a taboo topic in Scripture. Stewardship is a core part of discipleship. That's what it's about. It's not about fundraising, it's about discipleship. So make that so at your church. And also be sure that you're sharing stories, not just numbers. And helping people see that the ministry happens because of their gifts of financial stewardship. Involving more people, what does that mean? People support what they help build, so it might be time to get more voices in the conversation. Again, if you're at a church where the same group does the budget every year, trustees, you've gotten to be a smaller congregation, you have less people available to do that. This might be something that you would expand and say, hey, let's have an entire church meeting on this, so that folks can get buy-in from step 1. So also think about how long it takes to trust new ideas. If any of these you think, gosh, that just sounds so far out there, there's a pace that you have to move at. It's hard to force these. Again, if you're really in financial crisis and you know you need money right now, you can be thinking, well, Laura, we don't have time to build trust. So that's a different set of circumstances in some ways, but also I think, yes, you always need to be taking time to build trust. So getting more folks involved, building trust with them, this can help spark creativity too, of course. And things to think about there at the bottom, some different considerations. Who's leading the effort? What kind of tone are they setting? Again, that gets back to if the tone is the sky is falling, people will probably believe you and may even start pulling away rather than investing more, which is what you want. So be sure that the right folks are leading the conversation and setting the right tone. Identify ways to be transparent about financial decisions and what you're looking at, the situation that you're in. And if they have a whole resource on this, be happy to share. And make sure that you've got a plan, that you're not just trying this and trying that with no outcomes identified, no steps for how you're going to achieve those. Have a plan, take the time to make the plan, and again, get the right folks involved with that. So thinking about next steps that you want to take. I know we've covered a lot of ground in the last 30 minutes or so. So let's take a minute to think about where you might start. If you are at all familiar with the New Testament, and I know you are, then you will know that Jesus told a story about 3 servants who were each given resources to steward while the landowner was away. 2 of them put those resources to work, and 1 buried his. Out of fear, he said, and he returned exactly what he'd been given and nothing more. The landowner was not impressed. And when I think about that story and I think about income innovation, what strikes me here is that the servant who failed wasn't malicious. He was just afraid. How many of us feel afraid for our church's future? He was waiting and wanted to be safe. I would imagine many of us also want to be safe. We don't want to do anything that's going to jeopardize our congregation's vitality and viability. But in that story, Jesus says being afraid and waiting and wanting to be safe is not faithfulness. Faithfulness is doing something with what you've been given. So with that in mind, thinking about what your congregation has entrusted to it, let's think about what to do with it. And here you see 4 simple questions. What do you already have? That's that asset mapping: property, skills, relationships, programs. Don't overlook what you already have as you start to see what you could have. Most churches are richer in assets than they may realize. Second question is, what does your community need? Don't assume that you know what they need. What do they actually tell you when you ask? So if you don't know, that's a great first step. Spend a month having conversations with neighbors and local officials, nonprofit leaders, school staff, etc., and listen before you start doing anything else. Third question, where does your congregation have energy? This is so important because, again, the most financially promising idea in the world is going to fail if nobody's excited about it. So you have to find that intersection of where the congregation is already passionate, has gifts, is excited to do something, and then what the community needs and what people genuinely want to do with what you have, and see if God is there calling you to action. So that's where is God calling you. So as you think about how those, if we had a Venn diagram, they would be circles intersecting. God's at the heart of it, calling you to ministry. So my encouragement, my answer to anything right now for you is to pick one thing. Please don't think we've got to start one thing from each of these different avenues. Just pick one, start small, and do it well. Try to do it well, learn from it, and let it build trust with your congregation and your community and grow from there. You have to be comfortable with potentially not doing well when you start stepping into the alternative income stream. And that's something that I got out of the Funding Forward book. Too, as churches said, we couldn't be afraid to fail, and we had to be comfortable if we did have some failures along the way. Again, if you're sitting there thinking we can't afford to fail, we're really in financial crisis, that conversation could look a little different than this one. But I think for the mindset right now to be that you're going to be courageous and creative and know, like, we may not get this right first time out of the gate, so to speak, but you've got to be willing to try and to faithfully steward the resources that have been entrusted to you for the benefit of God's work in the world. So I think, again, most churches that I know of that have transformed their financial health through an alternative income stream didn't usually do it with one dramatic pivot. They did it with one faithful experiment that worked and gave them courage for the next one. So to that point, MFA is always happy to connect you with people who have done this so you can have good conversations with folks that have already journeyed along the way and learn from them. Mentioned resources and want to just make sure you have these to take away with you. Again, you'll get the slides after the webinar and the recording as well. Rooted Good is the source of two different resources that are of infinite value if you're thinking about renting property and if you're thinking about taxes. You see some screen grabs there for those two. What about taxes, as well as how to rent well? Be happy to connect you with those. Faith Lead is a group out of the Luther Seminary, and Grace Pomeroy, who wrote the Funding Forward book, is on their staff. They are a wonderful resource. Blog posts all the time, constantly saying what churches are doing what to be innovative with income and telling real stories of different ministries around the country and what's happening there. So I would encourage you to sign up for their e-newsletter, let that get into your inbox every week or however often it comes, so that you're reading those kinds of stories and it can help push conversations forward at your church. Similarly, churchleadership.com, that's the Lewis Center for Church Leadership. They have wonderful experts who are constantly writing articles and sharing videos, etc. A lot of great content that could help inform your decisions as you're thinking here. I would be short-sighted if I didn't mention, of course, MMFA as well as provincial and district offices. Those are resources, especially when it comes to grants. As I said before, maybe there's some grant making that you didn't know about that you're eligible for as a church in the Eastern District or here in the Southern Province. MMFA's grants are available for any church in North America, so I'd be happy to talk to you more about that, but don't hesitate to reach out to folks within the denomination. I just spoke to grant resources, but here again, you see MMFA, provincial district offices. I just did some quick searching to see current grant opportunities for faith-based organizations. Walmart's Spark Good program came up. I dove into it, make sure that's in fact true, because I no longer believe it just because I Googled and found it, right? And those are smaller amounts, but those would be great grants for feeding ministries, clothing closets, all kinds of community work that you probably are already doing as a church. Again, frees up your congregational resources for other expenses. Your community foundations, city and state. I did a quick exploration of the North Carolina Community Foundation, Wisconsin as well, just to kind of see what was out there. And there are some funds available for churches that are doing community impact type work. Again, it's not going to go to help you pay your staff or to pay your light bill, but it's going to go to help support that work that you're doing for your neighbors. And then finally, if your church is thinking about has some capital needs and is exploring grants there, listed two opportunities. The National Fund for Sacred Places is available only for historic church properties, so that narrows it down a little bit if you're not on a historic property. But we did have a Moravian church, Calvary Moravian, who just recently got a $300,000 matching grant from them to redo their roofs and steeple, et cetera. So there is money available out there through them for if you're in a historic building. And then finally, the Oldham Little Church Foundation does grants for any kind of church that's doing capital needs as well. So as I said before, grant work is very time consuming. It can also be expensive because a lot of the different websites that will share grantors with you, you have to pay money to access those lists. So this is something that, again, if you've got somebody in the congregation who's got some time on their hands and is willing to just spend an hour one day for a few days a week just exploring grant possibilities, you could get some good fruit from that, but it does take time to cultivate those lists. Okay, that is it from me. I'm going to stop sharing and just open up for a time of conversation, see if we have any questions. So give me just a second, and I'm also going to pause the recording so that we can have some conversation.